Terra Nil is a game about bringing life to a dead world. Each map starts you off in a barren plain, a destination identifiable only by absence. No tufts of grass, no trickles of water, no skittering critters or bounding majestic mammals, just an ocean of brown and grey. And then, rather unceremoniously, a wind turbine gets plonked down. A few toxic scrubbers to churn out the poison and return the land fertile. An irrigator to bring life to this necrotic space. And suddenly, the ground erupts into colour, green, a signifier of the supple rebirth of a once lost space. You can almost feel the texture of the soil between your toes, the sound of the wind rustling happily through the grass, the fresh smell of these verdant horizons. And you move on to the next patch of dirt. More machinery draws more life further from the land, your viridescent thumb expanding to the outer reaches of the world. As each mission progresses, you start to build up diverse biomes, churning and changing this tangible space using futuristic contraptions to create a Garden of Eden beyond human comprehension, introducing new flora and fauna to this world by creating the perfect conditions for life to flourish, and eventually your goal is to remove any evidence that you were ever there. Every one of Terra Nil's 8 missions ends with you recycling every building and machine used to create these intimate, personal biomes. All of it has to go. Leave no trace that this was anything other than the will of the Almighty. I don't really know how I feel about this. Terra Nil is a game meticulously made. Great care has gone into its design, its systems, and its presentation. It's a title that will make you think about man's relationship with the wilds, but it's also a game that, quite bafflingly, has nothing to say about that relationship. You might think it odd to think of a game so wrapped in the sublime iridescence of nature in this way, but through this statement I don't mean that Terra Nil is apolitical. The game has a strong ideological core, centered on the importance of protecting nature, the sanctity of these agrestal vistas. Its designers specifically cite the bountiful paradise on their own doorstep in South Africa as inspiration. Their goal is to show players the preciousness of the natural world and why preservation is so important. But that's not actually what you do in the game. The language of Terra Nil is very specific and direct. From the descriptions of the various stages of regeneration to that final message of wasteland reclaimed, all of your actions are coded as taking place after the fact, once the damage has already been done. While the developers are on record as seeing the project as a celebration of nature and of mankind's responsibility to maintaining its wonder, this comes across more like a debt to be repaid. That humanity in all its multifaceted glory has carved a great rift through the arteries of the world, and that this project, one that once again must be reiterated ends with the absence of human legacy, is the only means of atonement. Terra Nil is a game meticulously made. Great care has gone into its design, its user interface, and its beautifully presented manual. There is no thoughtlessness to be found here, but the game offers little in the way of an established mythology for its world. And while I don't necessarily think all games require conventional storytelling in this sense, the absence here feels like a hole the size of the universe. It can be felt in your moment-to-moment actions, in the process of regeneration, the satisfying burst of light that comes with achieving each composite part of your goals, the charming floral progress meter that oversees the whole endeavour, the impeccable sci-fi design of your ship and equipment, the tiny, imperceptible details that makes revisiting each map a further joy. Everything in this game is pointing towards a fable that just isn't there, a message indecipherable. A world with personality but no history, a statement of intent where every other word has been carved away. And this is where I think a big problem arises, because regardless of developer intent, Terra Nil is a deeply political game, but one that staunchly refuses to elucidate what those politics are. In isolation, no big dilemma is to be found here, But it's when you start to think about the potential diversity of their audience that things start to pull into focus. If you choose not to make a statement, or in this case to make half of one, invariably someone else will drum up a conclusion for you, and it might not be with good intention. Ecofascism is an ideology that is frequently barked blindly as a solution to our real-world climate troubles. The idea that the planet cannot sustain its current population and that this is the reason we are in the midst of an ongoing ecological crisis is one that is easily debunked by something as simple as examining the relationship between population centres and carbon footprints, but it has this insidious bent that keeps crawling back into discourse time and time again. It's a violent, institutionally racist lie, one that invariably targets the global south more than anywhere else on the planet, and that is laser-focused in its refusal to acknowledge that the experience of living is not homogeneous. The truth is, we don't know how many concurrent lives our planet can sustain. We cannot provide lab conditions to test this hypothesis, and as a result, any claim to its validity is ignorant speculation. There is, however, ample evidence for the impact of industrialization on the planet, and further proof that the consequence of such things can actually be stopped dead in its tracks before it's too late. Just look at global cooperative efforts such as the Montreal Protocol and how that has gone a long way to helping repair something that was once a major international concern. When was the last time you heard about the ozone layer? What I'm really getting at here is that the impact of mankind on its environment is not a broad church. There are very specific global agents responsible for recent climate trends. There's a well-trod statistic that often does the rounds online that just 100 companies are responsible for 71% of global emissions. While we should obviously take this affirmation with a pinch of salt, as these institutes are often driven by user consumption of their products and aren't just poisoning the ocean and burning the rainforest for shits and giggles, it's also important to recognize that demand too is often fueled by infrastructure more than anything else. Centralized economies, the variable quality of public transport links, and transactional cultural norms, to name but a few. These are all artificial modifiers to the human experience that are not shared by all. Before I continue, I would like to make clear that this is not a hit piece on Terra Nil. I don't believe that developer-free lives are actively pursuing an eco-fascist message in this work. Far be it from me to cast aspersions on a team based in a country that is currently experiencing a terrifying water crisis. These folk too are victims of climate change, which is why it's all the more baffling that there isn't even an ounce of this conversation in the game, despite environmental clues pointing towards this very thing. While many of the game's maps take place in nondescript land masses, the fourth mission is explicitly set in an urban wasteland, the detritus of a very familiar civilization, remnants of skyscrapers and apartment blocks to be carved away and repurposed. The whole place is waterlogged. You use a large piece of equipment called an undersea dredger to pull earthen materials from the sea floor to create new land masses that snake their way around these solemn rooftops. Partway through the mission, too much seismic activity from your dredgers triggers an earthquake that cracks the seal on some very suspect-looking silos, releasing an enormous amount of radioactive gas across the map. Something that must be dealt with before any new machines can be installed. It's a pain in the arse, to be honest. You find yourself inching your way across the screen fixing this. Down goes a windmill, down goes a toxic scrubber, down goes a power line, down goes a radiation cleanser, and the whole time I found myself thinking, what happened to the people who once lived here? Was their haunting absence immediate, swift and brutal, the result of international cooperation breaking down and men in suits, souls removed, pressing hungrily the big red button? Or was it a death by 1,000 cuts? A drawn-out starvation where the false narratives of personal responsibility and ugly nationalism chewed away at the fabric of society until one day there simply was nothing left to save. This, if nothing else, is a talking point. A clever bait and switch from previous missions that brings home the gravity of our own orbital fate. But it's also the start of a conversation that gets cut brutally short by rolling credits mere moments later. Once again, you remove all trace that you were ever here, for the finale grabbing up seeds from across the globe to be stored in an interstellar vault swiftly fired out into the heavens. One solitary remnant of your efforts, a launch site for this rocket, soon to be engulfed by the wilds. The following 4 missions are remixes of what you've already played, and while they are a refreshing mix-up of the mechanical ideas that came before, no further lore is to be found. Once again, it becomes Ludolic without the narrative. This is frustrating, but I can't really call this a fault of the game in the traditional sense. Yes, it's a little disappointing that it's so short. I genuinely felt like that final main mission was an Act 2 cliffhanger, that the game could have done with maybe 2 to 3 more unique missions that further explore this unanswered question I've just been lamenting. But I can't fault Terra Nil for not being what I wanted it to be, because I know that that was never the intention of the developers to have it be the catalyst for this particular conversation. They've made this explicitly clear. I think that when we're surrounded by news of climate catastrophes or post-apocalyptic dystopian visions of the future, it becomes easy to fall into apathy and think of a gloomy future as being inevitable. Lead artist Jonathan Hao-Yoon said in an interview with Game Rant. Instead, we give players agency to pull them out of despondency. A desolate wasteland? The tools to change it are within your grasp. We try to lean more into how full of wonder and beauty nature is, that it's worth caring for and preserving. If it inspires change, then all the better. I can understand the desire to pull yourself away from the grim reality of environmentalism and embrace the sublimity of the natural world. Escapism in small, digestible chunks is a healthy balm to soothe otherwise troubled minds, and I don't think Hao-Yoon's words or the game that Free Lives made projects something insidious out into the cultural space. The very fact I've written all of this is testament to the game's powerful presentation, and I have the utmost respect for everyone involved in the making of it. But despite all this, the thing I keep coming back to is this absence of humanity from the equation. Far from a vision of hope for an unsettled era, this feels like the most defeatist vision of the future one could possibly drum up. A future in which the dust has long settled, the remnants of mankind erased, and whatever has succeeded them presented with a blank slate for renewal. Even the visual language around your means of interacting with this world has this sterile, untouched texture. Everything is presented as distinctly inhuman. Your ship has no evidence of a crew, your instruction manual is written precisely and without textual embellishment. The various machines you use to resurrect this sepia space are fully automated. The only person involved in this whole operation, without so much as a fanfare, is you. Humanity has been erased completely from this narrative. This is most decidedly not preservation. I want to take a moment to talk about another game I've been playing recently that fits quite neatly into this conversation. Cloud Gardens is a puzzle game about nurturing plant life in spaces resplendent with the detritus of humanity. Traffic cones, shopping trolleys, tyres by the dozen. There are hundreds of objects, big and small, that litter these enigmatic spaces. But rather than erase such a disgraceful legacy, these objects act as a sort of catalyst for new life. A seed gets placed within one of these modest maps, and through the careful placement of objects around it, will burst forth into life. Vines climb, grass expands, flowers bud and bloom. Everything coalesces and intertwines with one another, a beautiful symbiosis of man and nature that delivers a very clear message about the resilience of the natural world. The thing is, Cloud Gardens does not have an explicit message, nor a defined narrative. Its developers too have stated in interviews that they built the game with an aesthetics-forward approach. Level designer Eli Corley said in an interview for Optopia, "We toyed with having a story, but ultimately decided to leave it completely open-ended." I think that a lot of themes that we end up playing with makes people think about climate change, which is definitely intentional, but ultimately the nature of the story of the wasteland is, at least for now, unspecified. The developer duo of Corley and Thomas van den Berg built a game about how plants grow in post-collapse spaces. Vines crawling over street signs, flowers blooming on the bonnets of abandoned cars. Like Terra Nil, there are no humans present in any of these intricate dioramas, but unlike Terra Nil, the goal in Cloud Gardens is not to erase man's historical footprint from the world, but rather to embrace it. It's no mistake that it's the artificiality of this world that becomes a sort of inorganic fertilizer for the blossoming flora set to envelop it. I think it's interesting that the game started out as a much more ambitious MMO Vandenberg was working on called Garbage Country, in which players would build settlements out of concrete structures. You would be able to grow plants amidst the rubble, and they would germinate and mature in real time. This component would eventually form the basis for the game we see today, and I like to think that it carries with it the spirit of its previous life. A statement on the resilience of the natural world, on the finiteness of man's gestalt, or simply a bunch of abandoned places that look cool when overrun by plant life. The crux of Cloud Garden's success stems from its willingness to look its history in the eyes. It may not want to tell you a story, but it certainly doesn't shy away from the consequences of its setting. The thing is, I don't particularly love Cloud Gardens any more than I do Terra Nil. It's a game that in many ways faces the same problems. It's fiddly without feeling satisfyingly challenging. It lacks a meaningful escalation of ideas, instead focusing on iteration. But it feels so much more like a complete game because it's not trying to hide the inconvenient truth of its setting. There's none of that ambiguity that stems from showing the audience part of a jigsaw puzzle that could so easily be filled in with the wrong pieces. The notion that anything in art can be apolitical when nothing in life is seems so utterly absurd when you stop to think about it for even a second, but here I'm willing to concede that there are distinct levels to a work's political nature that, to the untrained eye, seem more akin to absence than substance. A blank slate for the audience to project their own unconscious fears and desires onto can bring a lot to the table for some works, but what often gets presented as an opportunity for interpretation is in reality a reluctance to acknowledge that some ideological stances are inherently immoral. This distinction matters because when you refuse to be honest about the artistic values of your work, you run the risk of someone claiming its message on your behalf. When a game like Terra Nil refuses to examine its own thesis beyond humanity has killed the world, you open an invitation to a sycophantic adoration of technology and a repulsive attitude towards the lives currently being affected by environmental destruction, including those of the very people who made this beautiful, sorrowful thing. The future will not save you from the past. Time will not heal all wounds. An envisioned world without us is not the paradise you think it is, and if we refuse to challenge these false notions of who and what are responsible for our downfall, one day it really will be too late.